Among the most commonly asked questions I hear when I interact with my students outside of the material I teach is how I manage to pursue a life of science while being a person of faith. In my neck of the woods, the common assumption among many of my students is that faith and science are antithetical, that science is against God, or that it requires a scientist to be an atheist. This view comes from a number of places, I think. Among them, a misunderstanding of the ideas and processes of scientific inquiry, the Enlightenment attack on the church it so often blamed for many of society's ills, the deterministic and materialistic views of certain socioeconomic and political theories, such as Marxism, that claimed a scientific basis for their ideologies, among the reasons. There are also, however, those scientists who hold the position that with the advances made by science in the last 150 or so years, there is no longer a need to invoke a supernatural being to explain the various mysteries of the natural world. In this view, while not all such mysteries are fully understood, science has been thought to have been so successful in such a short period of time in explaining those that it has, that it is untenable to suggest that it will not be able to explain all that we encounter and observe using physical processes in such a way that there is no need for a god or gods. Such a position was expressed by William Provine in a 1988 editorial to the journal Science, and he went on to assert that it was therefore impossible for a person to be both a scientist and hold religious beliefs. He stated in no uncertain terms that science and religion were incompatible, and that those who were clinging to such a synthesis of belief systems to explain the worldview should, in his words, get over it, and abandon the superstition of religion for the rationality of science. As one might expect, the response to this editorial was significant, though not actually for his condemnation of the more radical elements of religious thought that rejected scientific process. Instead, it was the notion that one could not hold a worldview informed by both the methods and discoveries of science and an understanding of a greater reality that included a God. The journal Science received a greater response to this editorial than it had to any other article it had published to that date, from both those who sought to defend Provine's position and those who rejected it, identifying themselves among those who practiced science and held religious beliefs. As the discussion evolved, many of those who held Provine's position expressed surprise at the number of their colleagues who were also persons of faith. They wondered how so many of these individuals had suddenly appeared in the conversation, and did such a surge represent a step backward? This, of course, was an incorrect reading of the situation. It was not that so many of the faithful had infiltrated their ranks only recently, but rather that they had long been there, working alongside them, quietly finding their identity in both their professions as scientists and confessions of faith. In the minds of those who hold the view that science and faith are incompatible, the arrival of the modern scientific worldview during the Victorian period, heralded by the advances in atomic theory, Darwinian evolution, and liberal democracy, should have made faith-based explanations and justifications unnecessary, and thus led to their being discarded. However, in that period, and shortly after, another view arose among the many religious thinkers that suggested that faith and science were not competitive in their power to explain the human experience, but rather complementary. One place where this view was developed and effectively enunciated was in northern England at the end of the 19th century, among a small and almost forgotten Christian denomination. Among their number was a talented young physicist and mathematician who would find in this new expression of an older faith a way towards a fully integrated life based on the values shared between the methods of scientific inquiry and the path of seeking a deeper relationship with the Almighty. Thus, in examining the life of Arthur Stanley Eddington, we can find an alternative to Provine's position and assess whether it offers insight into the question of whether one can hold both scientific and religious worldviews simultaneously. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 49.1, Supplemental. Arthur Stanley Eddington. Faith and Science. This episode kicks off a series of biographical shows that will hopefully provide some insight into the world of both theoretical and observational science, specifically physics and astronomy, as well as the interdisciplinary subjects that grow out of the intersection between the two, astrophysics and cosmology. My goal through these episodes is to, by looking at the lives and work of a number of individuals who inquired about the nature of the cosmos, give you, the listener, a chance to see how science is really done, as well as to see how their backgrounds, perspectives, and beliefs shape that person's talents and skills. Nowhere, I think, is this more evident than with Arthur Stanley Eddington, whose integration of faith and science has, in many ways, served as a template for many liberal thinkers who were faced with the conundrum of reconciling the claims of a religious perspective many thousands of years old with an understanding of nature that has been sort of scientifically established within just the last century or two. Eddington was born in the Lake District of England, in the old country of Cumbria, in the northwest corner of the kingdom proper, in the town of Kendal, on December 28, 1882. His parents were of Quaker descent, a matter to which we shall return shortly, and his father, Arthur Henry, was part of a family who had long farmed in the region around Somerset in the far southwest part of the country. His mother, Sarah Ann Shout, similarly came from a family with a long association with the Society of Friends, as the Quakers are formally known. Arthur Henry had studied in a number of Friends schools before attending university to study philosophy, spending time in Europe at Heidelberg before returning to England to take up teaching. Upon his return, the elder Eddington tutored for a time at Owens College in Yorkshire before becoming the headmaster of Stramongate School in Kendal, which was a grammar and preparatory school funded by the society in that region. Arthur Henry arrived at the school in 1878 and immediately brought a certain energy to the institution, grounded in a Quaker Reformation movement that was beginning to take hold at the time. In that year, Arthur and Sarah welcomed their first daughter into the world, and 4 years later, a son named Arthur Stanley. All seemed to be set for the young family that held an esteemed position in a community that respected both education and the headmaster that provided it. Unfortunately, tragedy would strike just 2 years later when, in 1884, an epidemic of typhoid gripped the region and took the 34-year-old Arthur Henry. Sarah, now bereft of income upon her husband's death, relocated back to southwest England to be closer to the extended family, living first with her mother-in-law, then in Varzin along Walliscote Road. Here the family would remain until 1914, when they would move to join Arthur in Cambridge. Sarah's family identified with a more conservative part of the Friends movement, and so Stanley was raised in an austere fashion that forsook drinking, smoking, or theater of any kind. Instead, the young Stanley, as he was known, was encouraged towards more practical pursuits and in an enjoyment of the outdoors. The stories go that he was very good with numbers at an early age, learning his 24 by 24 multiplication tables before he could read, and counting both the number of letters in the Old Testament book of Genesis and the number of stars on a dark night. As is sometimes the case, whether due to the straining of trying to count and read or by genetics, Eddington became nearsighted in his middle youth, and, as I'm sure many of my bespectacled listeners can remember, when he was finally fitted with glasses, he was fascinated with the detail he could see, something he had once taken for granted. And as a personal note here, I can remember my experience with this at about the same age as Eddington had been. My vision had gone bad over the summer, and so when I complained of headaches at school that next school year, the teacher recommended to my parents that I see an optometrist. I can vividly remember getting out of the car at home after the appointment, wearing my new set of glasses, and looking across the street at the tall tree that was in my neighbor's backyard. What had been earlier that day just a big fuzzy green mass was now resolved into thousands of individual leaves, each moving and shimmering in the late afternoon breeze and sunshine. I must have stood there 10 minutes watching it in amazement. A. Vilbert Douglas, in his biography of Eddington, suggests that this is the event that molded the scientist to be's eventual view, put forth in his book, The Philosophy of Physical Science, that it is in those things that can be observed that science must eventually subject itself to. As far as formal schooling goes, Eddington was homeschooled at first, before going to a small prep school. At age 11, he was enrolled at the Bremellin School in Weston-super-Mare, a high school of sorts for children of the members of the Society of Friends that had been founded by a classmate of his father's. For the next 4 years, this school would play a very important role in Eddington's intellectual development, and he would study mathematics, physics, and literature there. Given his family's difficult financial circumstances, Stanley, and this was, by the way, what he would be called by those who knew him to sort of distinguish him from his father, Stanley would apply for whatever scholarships he could to help defray the cost of his education. At this time in England, most financial support was merit-based, and so Eddington took, or sat for as it's called, a variety of exams to demonstrate his talent. In 1896, at the age of 14, he achieved first class in the Cambridge Junior Locals, and in 1898, he was awarded a £60 stipend for a period of 3 years to attend college at any college of his choice. He soon added to that another £80 per annum by winning scholarship competitions sponsored by the University of London and Victoria University. While this was certainly a large enough grant to attend university, it was unlikely to be enough to really get along at a place like Cambridge or Oxford. Moreover, while the ban on attendance at these institutions by those confessing non-Anglican or what is sometimes called non-conformist faiths, that ban had been lifted a generation earlier, it was pretty well understood that the Oxbridge colleges, as they were known, weren't exactly welcoming to those outside of the norms of typical English life at the time. Given Eddington's focus on math and the sciences, and his Quaker background, the logical choice for both financial and social reasons was to attend Owens College at the University of Manchester. Deep in the heart of nonconformist England and part of the industrial and manufacturing region of the country, Manchester had long been a place for those seeking careers outside of politics, law, and civil service. More specifically, Owens College, the heart of the university, was anchored around Dalton Hall, incidentally named for the Quaker chemist and physicist John Dalton. The principal of Dalton Hall was John William Graham, a man who had been a colleague and co-worker of Eddington's father. Graham was to have an enormous influence on Stanley, both as a scientist and as a man of faith. It is here that we need to take a digression and talk a bit about the Society of Friends, their history, and the developments in the movement coming into the turn of the 20th century. As I discuss these developments, please understand that I'm only giving the briefest of thumbnails about the topic. I certainly don't mean to neglect or slight any important aspect of this particular tradition of Christianity, and if I've left out something important, I apologize. The Society of Friends had been founded in the 1650s by the itinerant preacher and mystic George Fox in northern England as a response to the increasingly divisive conflicts between the Church of England, the Catholic Church, and the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. Fox saw that the religious statements of faith and dogmas of each tradition as something that created division within the body of Christ and in the individual as well, and thus that led to a profound confusion for the believer as to which creed was the correct one. In response to this, Fox taught that all believers could come to know God directly through a personal experience centered on what was known as either an inward or inner light, a divine spark found in all humans. As this inward light was equally available to all who sought the divine, this meant that there could be no clergy or hierarchy in a congregation of seekers, as to have such a structure would invalidate the belief that revelation was obtained through direct mystical experience. As a result of this, all gathering of this new society of friends were held without an order of worship or a liturgy, with the gathered congregates meeting in silence until someone was moved to rise and offer an account of some aspect of their mystical experience. Moreover, all decisions of a congregation were made by strict consensus, and there was an ethic of absolute adherence to the truth in both action and deed, something that led to a refusal to take oaths. Finally, their egalitarian structure and mindset led Fox's followers towards pacifism and social justice in their outward expression of their faith, in a way that ran counter to much of the religious thinking of the time when church and state were deeply intertwined. Now, as students of English history will recall, the period of time when Fox was gathering adherents to his radical new view of how to practice the Christian faith was one of great political upheaval, with the Troubles, as they were called at the time, leading to the beheading of King Charles I and the time of Oliver Cromwell's rule. These political upheavals had significant religious aspects to them, one that often required a certain orthodoxy of confession. The Quakers, with their rejection of all creedal statements or taking of oaths, were not looked upon favorably, and so suffered more than a little bit of persecution on account of their beliefs. This continued at least for a short time after the restoration of Charles II, when all nonconformist faiths were persecuted to a greater or lesser extent. Throughout his life, Fox was arrested on several occasions, as were many of his followers, for holding to their faith. So, as is often the case in these sorts of things, this persecution soon became part of both the society's identity and as something of a recruiting tool. The Society of Friends may have rejected the typical norms of British expressions of faith, but they weren't exactly what would be known as fire-breathing radicals, nor did they ever plot to overthrow the state. Instead, they were best known for their modest lives, their honest ways, and their desire to settle disputes without violence, something a number of Englishmen at that time found very attractive. When they'd get arrested for living in this way, their neighbors tended to take notice and wondered who were really supposed to be the bad guys in all of this. Before long, this sense of persecution for doing the right things and living the right way became a fundamental part of the Quaker identity in Britain. However, in short time, attitudes in England began to soften towards nonconformist faiths in general and the society in particular. While the Quaker community was insular by necessity and choice, they were officially allowed to exist after the Religious Toleration Act of 1689, and though they were still barred from participating in a number of the official institutions of Britain, notably, as we mentioned earlier, many of the universities such as Oxford and Cambridge, they were allowed to freely associate and establish institutions of their own. Over the course of the 18th century, the Society founded a number of high schools and colleges, both in southwest England and in the northern part of the country, most notably the industrial centre Manchester, where the university took on a much more technical and practical flavor than many of its fellow institutions of higher education. It would be here that the best and brightest of the Quaker community would be educated throughout the 1700s and 1800s. As the persecution and repression of their faith diminished, one of the strongest senses of identity for the Friends was removed, and the movement went into what is sometimes called by historians its quietistic period, where members kept to themselves, lived socially conservative lives, and trained their children to adopt their values. In time, the energy of the movement began to ebb, and many communities began to watch as families started reintegrating into the larger society, adopting its values. Nowhere was this more evident than in the practice of pacifism, especially on a societal level. The movement actually hit something of a crisis of faith in response to some of Britain's more unsavory wars of empire. The response of the Friends movement to these hostilities had been lukewarm at best, and it called into question whether or not the movement was still an entity that stood outside of the broader world. Concurrent to this, and also in response to it, there were two developments that would create a change within the Quaker movement starting in the mid-1800s. The first was the import of a decidedly more evangelical version of Quakerism from the United States following the Second Great Awakening there. Quakerism had been part of the earliest fabric of the American Republic, and it had to struggle with the same issues their British cousins were now dealing with about a century earlier. Due to the two Great Awakenings in America, there had been a significant shift in focus of the movement on the western side of the Atlantic towards a much stronger position on the inerrancy of Scripture and the need to profess one's beliefs that was in line with much of what was taking place among the newer Protestant denominations that were profoundly evangelical in outlook that were developing in the United States. These ideas made their way back across the Atlantic, and a number of evangelical Quakers took them up and began to push towards a new way of being a Quaker. While the energy associated with this new version of the movement motivated many in the society, the emphasis on creedal and doctrinal uniformity concerned many, especially those who felt it necessary for Quakerism to not become just another version of this new Protestantism. Moreover, many of those who had reservations began to see the inevitable conflict that would arise between the ancient biblical texts and tradition and the new knowledge that science was discovering at an ever-increasing pace. So it was that in the late 1880s, the society, at least in Britain, found itself on something of a precipice. The evangelical faction was strongly advocating that the central decision-making body adopt what was known as the Richmond Declaration, while the quietist conservatives were just as strongly opposing such a move. It was at this point that a third way emerged from the struggle that would be known as the Manchester movement. While it would be easy to label this as a liberal faction, such labels don't make as much sense as you might think, given that the quietistic group was seen as the conservatives and the evangelical faction was said to be bent on liberalizing the old ways. Instead, if a label is to be applied, it might be best to say that this group within the society saw themselves as progressive in that they wished to embrace the fundamental tenets of Fox's original ideas as a way to move forward in the modern world. Among these ideas was a much stronger position on pacifism, a position on Scripture that held it to be a historical document and thus subject to human error, and an integration of all aspects of the life of the faithful. In each of these positions was Fox's central idea of an inward light that inhabited all human beings. Thus, killing and warfare was an affront to this, as the aim of that activity was to snuff out the inward light of others. Scripture, while held to be revelatory, was now seen as secondary to that sense of personal experience each follower could access, and so biblical inerrancy was no longer a necessary requirement to live a faithful life. Finally, with inerrancy removed as an obstacle, the follower was freed to recognize the divine in all aspects of creation through the guidance of that inward light. This approach rejected the need for formal creeds found in other denominations, once again affirming Fox's original approach to the life of faith. This new expression of a progressive Quakerism quickly found many adherents, as it successfully recaptured the uniqueness of the Society of Friends as a movement, while also creating a place for the faithful in the increasingly scientific world of the late Victorian and early Edwardian periods. Among the adherents to this view was Eddington's father and those friends that surrounded him. Even after his death, as the family moved back to that much more conservative and quietistic environment, those of his friends would be among those who would teach at and run the schools that Eddington attended as he moved through his youth, and in due time, they would point him towards Owens College and the heart of the Manchester movement. This movement got its name from a hugely attended conference held in the city in 1895 while Eddington was actually still back in high school, and it's rightly seen by many as the beginning of what is thought of as a Quaker Renaissance. A number of prominent friends spoke at the various sessions of this conference, none so important to our story as Sylvanus P. Thompson, a physicist and engineer who gave a talk titled, quote, "Can a scientific man be a sincere friend?" quote. In it, he laid out a vision of faith that fully integrated the practices of scientific inquiry and faith in a modern context. He argued that, unlike early Quaker thinkers who held to a position of natural theology, wherein it was thought that natural philosophy and science really were just there to demonstrate that God existed and that he was present in the world, science and faith were instead complementary practices that addressed different sorts of questions. In this view, science no longer served only to prove the existence of God by examination of the natural world, as that was now thought to be impossible. Instead, God was held to be supernatural, and thus outside the purview of science. This left questions of humanity's relationship with God as the sole prerogative of theology, while science was seen as the proper path to understanding the creation. Thus, in Thomson's new synthesis, a sincere friend could investigate the natural world using the tools of science while also pursuing a deeper understanding of the divine through seeking the inward light using the tools of Quaker theology. What was really important in this new formulation was that the tools of each area of inquiry had a great deal in common. They both had an emphasis on asking questions and seeking answers. They both saw the practice of, quote, accurate thought and careful expression as being central to what was going on. And they saw that the doing of this required a great deal of humility on the part of the practitioner. Moreover, Thomson extolled that to participate in both was the quote-unquote sacred duty of those suitably gifted, saying, quote, he who neglects his intellectual powers is not only an intellectual coward, he is defying the purposes of the Almighty, just as truly as if he were to starve himself or put out his own eyes. End quote. In other words, God had made humanity to explore and inquire about the natural world, just as he had made humanity to be in relationship with him. And the same faculties that guided the following in one realm guided them in the other. This would lead to a process of progressive revelation where each generation would gain new insights into both the divine and the natural world, and thus revise and reform the ideas of those who had come earlier. It was an entirely new vision of the interaction between science and faith at the time, and it gained widespread acceptance among the attendees and other speakers at the Manchester Conference, and in time throughout the Society of Friends. Among the other speakers at the conference was John William Graham. He spoke eloquently at the end of the conference about reestablishing the Friends' emphasis on seeking the inward light and the centrality of personal religious experience as the fundamental touchstones of Quakerism. And following the conference's close, he took a position as the principal of Dalton Hall at Owens College. Graham was interesting in part in that as a Quaker, he had been among the few of his denomination who had taken advantage of the removal of the barriers to attend the Oxbridge group of universities by attending first the University of London and then Cambridge with an emphasis in mathematics. He was a profoundly progressive friend, and he saw his leadership of Dalton Hall, the Quaker heart of Owens College, as his chance to teach the principles of the Manchester Conference to a generation of young Quaker students, among them one Arthur Stanley Eddington, who enrolled at Owens College in 1898. It can be fairly said that no individual or institution had a greater influence on the formation of Eddington's core beliefs than did Graham and Owens College. It would be Graham who would be among the first at Owens to recognize Eddington's prodigious abilities as a mathematical and scientific thinker, as well as his deep commitment to the Quaker faith. As such, he took the 16-year-old under his wing and guided him towards a more mature understanding of his religious heritage, and saw to it that he was able to take full advantage of the educational opportunities made available to him at Manchester. When Eddington arrived at Owens College, he was just shy of his 16th birthday, special arrangements having had to have been made on account of his age just so that he could attend. As was The custom with students at the time, he took a series of entrance exams that allowed the faculty to assess his abilities and place him in the appropriate classes. He completed the exams with the highest scores of all entering students in physics, mathematics, and the classics, and was only bested in chemistry and English. This put him on the fast track in a physics program headed by Arthur Schuster and Horace Lamb. Schuster came from a German Jewish family that had immigrated to England and had returned to his home country to study spectroscopy under Gustav Kirchhoff. After earning his PhD, he moved to Cambridge to work at the recently established Cavendish Laboratory under James Clerk Maxwell before moving on to Owens. He served for a few years as the chair of applied mathematics until in 1887 he succeeded Balfour Stewart as chair of physics, and Lamb was hired to fill his now vacated seat. Together, the two men created a dynamic program that emphasized the idea of integrating both mathematics and application under the goal of developing the student's physical intuition as a function of both lab work and student research. At a time when much of physics education consisted of learning mathematical derivations that express various physical laws or theories, this emphasis on experiential learning was something revolutionary. And if you will recall, at about this same time at MIT, Edward Charles Pickering was independently doing much the same thing with the physics curriculum there. By the time Eddington had arrived, Schuster and Lamb had had about a decade to implement their ideas, and so it was through their influence that he would have absorbed two really fundamental values that would have crossed over from his scientific life to be integrated into similar lessons he was learning from Graham in his spiritual life. The first of these was the preeminence of experience in the guiding work or the guiding sort of approach in the life of a physicist. While mathematics was vitally important to the work of physics, the entire enterprise rested on conceptions derived from ideas that were built upon a person's observations of how nature actually behaved. These concepts would then be represented mathematically, and from these mathematical frameworks or models, which is the best way to really think of them, additional consequences could be deduced and then tested in an approach not unlike that put forth by Galileo some 300 years earlier. In this, science was something that was done, a process that was participated in rather than being a static body of knowledge to be mastered. This would have reinforced Graham's emphasis on the Quaker practice of seeking the inward light as being the path to a fuller understanding of the divine. This would have included the rejection of old, pre-formulated doctrines and creeds developed before the rise of the modern world, and thus woefully inadequate for dealing with the newly arising understanding of the universe and structures of liberal government that emphasized human rights and the consent of the governed over the medieval ideas of divine rule and separated classes of humanity. The second value that Schuster emphasized as part of the curriculum was the international and communal nature of doing science. Obviously influenced by his own background as something of an outsider to any particular national or cultural identity, Schuster would have seen science and the community of its practitioners as something that gave him and those others around him their true identity. More than being a German or a Jew, Schuster saw himself as a scientist, and that was how he saw others who did the kinds of things that he did. He would write, quote, "I do not wish to exaggerate the civilizing value of scientific investigation, but the great problems of creation link all humanity together, and it may yet come to pass that when diplomacy fails, and it often comes perilously close to near failure, it will fall to men of science and learning to preserve the peace of the world." End quote. Of course, these ideas would be shattered some 15 years later when the scientific communities of each nation would throw themselves into the war effort in 1914. But that's a topic for later in our story. This idea of internationalism would have been extraordinarily resonant with the pacifism Eddington was learning from Graham. In fact, Graham can said to have been perhaps the strongest of the voices in the Society of Friends at that time, advocating for a more active and engaged approach to George Fox's initial ideas and practices on the subject. Not merely content to stand against warfare, Graham extolled the Quaker community to question the policies of state-building and imperialism the British government was undertaking that led to the various wars of empire that had extinguished the inward light of so many across the globe in pursuit of vainglorious wealth and honor. As author Matthew Stanley says, whose book, by the way, Practical Mystic, is serving as a primary source for this series of episodes, Eddington's emerging value system would contain several of these, what Stanley calls valence values, wherein something from his spiritual life would find a comparable value from his scientific life that would allow him to integrate the two aspects so deeply and fully that he would see no contradiction in being both scientific and religious. This term, obviously taken from chemistry, comes from the idea that electrons in the outer energy levels of one atom are able to interact with the outer electrons in other atoms to form bonds that create molecules. In this same way, values and principles from Eddington's scientific and religious lives would come together to link the two inseparably. While there are other examples of similar integrations of values beyond this idea of the basis of experience and internationalism, we will address those in the portions of Eddington's life when they become important in distinguishing his approach to a problem or controversy in a way that was distinct from his colleagues. Eddington's time at Owens College was very successful, and near the end of his time there, his professors saw that he had outgrown the small department and what it could offer. Thus, when he finished the requirements for his Bachelor of Science, he was encouraged to sit for an entrance scholarship competition for Trinity College, Cambridge in 1901. Doing very well on the exam, he was awarded a £75 annual scholarship to pursue graduate studies at the venerable institution of Newton, Maxwell, Raleigh, and Thomson. To his mother, who worried about her Quaker son being sent to the heart of Anglican England, Graham would write, quote, "He will find a larger sphere and more competition at Cambridge, and I trust we will hear that he is bearing himself well under it." End quote. At Cambridge University, there is an examination that dates back to the earliest days of the institution's founding. Known as the Mathematics Tripos, it is a series of tests, usually of 15 or so of them, consisting of over 200 questions given over the course of about 45 or 50 hours spread across 8 or so days. It was, at that time, a test of both mathematical skill and physical endurance, and passing it marked the person as a scholar of some merit. Those who passed the exam were awarded honors, with those who did especially well being known as wranglers. The person who placed best on the exam during a given year was known as the senior wrangler, a title that marked him or her for life. When Eddington arrived at Cambridge, he immediately set himself to taking the test in the usual way of the time by hiring a coach, someone generally not associated with the university faculty, usually a previous wrangler, who would guide the candidate through their preparations. In addition, Eddington also took as many mathematics classes as he could. In these courses, he distinguished himself to the point that he had his scholarship increased to £100 in his second term at Cambridge. He also met and became close friends with C.J.A. Trimble, and that friendship would last throughout his life. In addition, he joined a number of sporting and academic clubs, as well as became a very active member of the Society of Friends chapter there at Cambridge. In his second year, he took the somewhat unusual step of actually sitting for the Tripos exam, something that was usually, though not always, done in a student's third year. What was really remarkable, though, was that he made the highest score and became the senior wrangler. Not only was this the first time a second-year student had ever been so named, it was the first time a Quaker had earned the distinction. As you might imagine, it was an accomplishment lauded and celebrated back at Owens College. During this time, he also embraced Graham's vision of a more activist faith, and he joined a number of political activities in support of Britain's Liberal Party. When the Conservative candidate for Prime Minister, Balfour, was defeated, he and his fellow classmates at the increasingly liberal university celebrated long into the evening. It was also during this time that Eddington began to relax some of the more strict aspects of his conservative upbringing. In his final year, he began to smoke a pipe, an accoutrement he was seldom seen without in later years, as well as enjoying an occasional glass of wine. After his third year, in 1905 at the age of 23, Eddington graduated with his Bachelor of Arts degree and found himself at something of a loss as to what to do next. While income wasn't really an issue, since he could make all the money needed coaching new candidates for the Tripos exam, he felt that he needed to have more of a calling. Unfortunately, one didn't immediately present itself. Over the summer, then, he accepted an offer of a member of the Royal Society to coach the man's son in Ireland. In September, he returned to Cambridge to find that the engineering school was in need of a temporary lecturer to stand in for at least a time due to a failed faculty search. As all of this was playing out, though, there were other things in motion that Eddington knew little about. The chief assistant at the Greenwich Royal Observatory had recently resigned his post to take the position as the Royal Astronomer of Scotland. England's Astronomer Royal, W.H.M. Christie, began to look for a replacement in the traditional fashion of soliciting names of individuals who had shown some talent in a demonstrable way in working with numbers and calculations. As you might expect, this meant that one of the groups that was always considered were the recent senior wranglers that had graduated from Cambridge. As Christie went through the names, Eddington's came up, and when he sent out inquiries and got a number of very positive responses, he felt he had something worth looking into. Checking into Eddington's background in physics, especially with his practical experience as part of the Owens curriculum, Christie realized that Eddington was just the man he was after. In his recommendation to the Secretary of the Admiralty, the organization, by the way, that ran the observatory, Christie wrote, quote, "Mr. Eddington thus possesses in a high degree both theoretical and practical qualifications for the post, and I find there is a general consensus of opinion among those whom I am consulted that, amongst the candidates available, he is the one best suited to perform the duties of chief assistant." End quote. Interestingly, Eddington, while flattered by the offer, was not keen to take the post. He had heard that he was under consideration, but that he was not very likely to be selected, possibly on account of his religious background, and so he had sort of discounted the notion altogether. Thus, when the offer, at least, for a final interview arrived, he was of the opinion that he would be better off declining it. However, as is always prudent in such cases, he went in for that final interview and ended up accepting the offer. Writing to his mother, he said, quote, "You will wonder what has changed my opinion since I mentioned the matter to you in the vacation. There are several reasons. For one thing, the fact of the post being offered to me, instead of being a possibility, makes an unconscious difference in one's point of view. Then I found that they were anxious for and seemed to have room for a physicist, and that they do not particularly want anyone acquainted with the ordinary Part II dynamical observatory. But especially I was influenced by the enthusiasm of the dons here, and in this case he means the professors at Cambridge. Whittaker most strongly recommended it. I think it was a good deal his influence which has got me the post. Finally, I have been down to Greenwich and to a certain extent seen for myself. My work will mainly be in the daytime, but especially during my first year, I shall have to observe at nights a good deal in order to understand the instruments thoroughly." End quote. In fact, actually, so meager were Eddington's skills at astronomical observation that he had to spend considerable time at the Cambridge Observatory learning technique prior to assuming his position at the Greenwich Observatory. That lack notwithstanding, though, the position turned out to be an excellent fit for the young man. It gave him the opportunity to work on research full-time with the latest and best observations to guide the mathematical modeling program he was expected to work on. He would spend the next 7 years in the position, and, while there, establish himself as one of the preeminent astrophysicists in the world. Unfortunately, he had somewhat less luck finding a Quaker community in London that shared his progressive views on the direction the Society of Friends was going. Each congregation that he attended was either too conservative or too evangelical, and so he was left to find his own path for a time, attending first the 1907 Peace Conference in Rotterdam and then the 1908 Kendal Summer School. These events further expanded the Manchester vision of the Quaker Renaissance and instilled in Eddington both a deeper sense of the international nature and shared humanity of the movement, as well as a deeply mystical element to the idea of religious experience. The nature of this mysticism was not inward, as was so often the case during this period of time, but rather outward, into a direct engagement with the world and an experience of the divine within it. One speaker, Rufus M. Jones, would call those who practice such a life, quote-unquote, practical mystics, and he described them in the following way, quote, "They are very busy persons, overloaded with their own life work, their vocation, but that in no way prevents them from being transmitters of great moral and spiritual forces. Quite to the contrary, they are all the better transmitters, because they are steadied and stabilized with the weighty occupation." End quote. Jones would go on to describe an active and pragmatic faith that arose from the inward light and infused all aspects of Quaker life, leading to an active expression of a progressive model of religious practice that respected the divine spark in all persons. This was especially true in the idea that pacifism meant peacemaking, not just peace abiding. It was a way of life as opposed to just an idea or theory. Pacifism in Jones's presentation of it was something the friend was and did, and this would have a profound impact on Eddington, and actually would nearly cost him his liberty and his reputation just a few years later. This is, I think, a good place for us to wrap up this episode. What with Eddington starting his professional life and having acquired many of the values that would guide him going forward. As we conclude, though, there are a couple of stories I'd like to share about the man. The first is something that I've mentioned in a previous episode, but I'd like to place in a greater context here. As I mentioned there, Eddington was an avid cyclist, something he and I actually share. But this actually fell into a much larger pattern of Eddington being just an extraordinarily active person. Like a number of other exceptional physicists we've discussed over the course of this podcast, Eddington enjoyed being outdoors and spent a lot of time hiking as well as cycling. While he would never take up the mountaineering his German colleagues so often participated in, he did play rugby, cricket, and even a little golf, though it is said that he was notoriously bad at that last activity. Ever the scientist, he made extensive notes about his journeys, whether by foot or two wheels, and even coined what is now known as the Eddington number, which is the largest number of days one has ridden a certain number of miles. In other words, if you've ridden a bicycle 50 miles 50 times, then you're said to have an Eddington number of 50. There is an equivalent number in hiking as I understand it. His Eddington number for cycling was 85, with the longest distance he rode in 1 year being a bit over 2,500 miles. What I find remarkable about this is that he did it in a time before automobiles and thus well-maintained roads. I can sort of imagine him rolling over a rocky cart path on a heavy steel bike that had just one or maybe two gears, which makes his accomplishments in terms of his riding seem just all the more impressive. So wide-ranging was his interest in sports that once when visiting Shapley at Harvard, he insisted on going and seeing the Red Sox play. The point of all this, I guess, is to show that the old stereotype that nerds aren't good at sports is pretty much shown here to be invalid by the life of a man who never stopped enjoying participating in those sports. The other story I'd like to share has to do with the celebration of Eddington's being awarded the title of Senior Wrangler there at Owens College. Ever mindful of the role so many others played in his success, he went out of his way to mention those who had had much to do with his level of excellence that got him the award. In referring to his respect and admiration for his mathematics professor at Owens, Horace Lamb, he said in his address to the college that while he now knew what it was to be treated as something of a lion, his ambition was to become something of a lamb. I should also say something about my sources for this and the following episodes. One of the difficulties about trying to get good source information about figures such as Eddington, and also this was the case when I was researching the information for the Hale biographies that I did, is that most of the work about those individuals is actually pretty uncritical in a historical sense. In fact, it almost borders on hagiographic, sort of the life of a saint kind of thing. What exists is usually just covers the biographical details of the individual's life and then extols their accomplishments without really trying to understand the person's views or motivations in any fundamental way. Moreover, any failings or contradictions of the person's lives are usually completely ignored, with the result being a work that, while not being, inaccurate, is at best incomplete and thus often misleading. In this way, I've chosen to use Douglas's biography as a straightforward recitation of Eddington's life. To this, however, I've tried to find sources that are more discerning in their attempts to understand his values and thought processes, and it is here that Stanley's Practical Mystic and Arthur Miller's Empire of the Stars will add much to the broader story. For those interested in delving into the intersection of faith and science, Stanley's book is truly excellent. I've personally found great insight in its pages in a more full understanding of my own journey between these two aspects of my own life, and I heartily recommend it even for those who reject the Quaker approach to religion. On a different note, this week's shout out goes to my students who survived their finals and thus have earned a long break from the rigors of physics. To all of the college students out there who have recently finished their end of the term exams, I hope you've had as much success. For my part, while grading exams and papers did gobble up about a week of my life, I'm happy to report that I've kept my sanity and will be returning to a more regular publishing schedule for the show. Alas, if only my financial situation allowed me to devote my full-time energies to podcasting. Oh well, such is life. If you are interested in learning more about the Odyssey or keeping up with us between episodes, you can like us on Facebook, just search for the Scientific Odyssey, or you can follow me on Twitter @ChadDavies. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever your favorite podcatcher is so that you don't miss an episode. Finally, thanks to the musicians of the Blue Dot Sessions for letting us use their atmospheric compositions to add a bit of texture to our journey. If you'd like to hear more of their work, you can find them at www.sessions.blue. Next week, we'll take a look at the birth of Eddington's scientific career, the first controversy he engaged in, and the tumultuous and personally difficult events during and after the Great War. Until then, full sails on your journey.